For a change, we are discussing a non-COVID subject in these COVID times, where most of our webinars are revolving around COVID. But nonetheless, other testing is also important, and we must not forget that these thyroid patients are actually chronic patients who keep coming for repeated rechecks of their thyroid function tests. And not to say that their doses sometimes need to be readjusted because of these COVID settings also. So thyroid function test and how to interpret these results is very important, because after diabetes, thyroid is the most common endocrine problem that we encounter in this country, rather worldwide. And sometimes interpreting these thyroid results can be challenging, because there are more than couple of rules that are applied here. So I will begin with the basic physiology first. We all know, but just to refresh, that the hypothalamus secretes TRH, which stimulates the pituitary gland, which in turn secretes the TSH, which then stimulates the thyroid gland, which is a small gland in the neck near the Adam's apple, which secretes these two hormones T3 and T4, and these hormones in turn cause a feedback inhibition, and they eventually go back and inhibit the secretion of TSH from the pituitary. This is the basic feedback loop of thyroid as it happens in a normal person. So as I just said, that once TSH is synthesized from the pituitary and released, it does two things. It helps the thyroid gland to concentrate iodine and synthesize the two hormones T3 and T4. These two hormones are secreted in a molar ratio of 14:1, which means that for 14 molecules of T4, the thyroid gland would secrete only one molecule of T3. So the thyroid gland produces more T4 than T3, which in turn goes to the peripheral tissues, where T4 is also converted into T3 using an enzyme called 5-deiodinases. So as you can see here, this T4 is going into the tissues, and with the help of this enzyme is being converted into T3, which is actually performing the more metabolic activity. It is more metabolically the more active form. T3 is more metabolically active than T3. So only 0.03% of T4 and 0.3% of T3 are not bound to proteins. Hence, they are called these fractions are called the free T4 and free T3. And these are the physiologically active forms of the hormones. The rest of the hormone which is bound to the protein, whether it is thyroid binding globulin or transthyretin or thyroid binding albumins, are actually the physiologically inert forms of the hormones. So FT3 and FT4 are more important than total T3 and total T4. And amongst FT3 and FT4, FT3 is the more biologically active thyroid hormone. It is about 3 to 4 times more potent than T4. So this understanding of physiology is important, because this is going to help us choose the correct replacement therapy for hypothyroid patients. As you can see, the difference between T4 and T3. T4 is more protein bound compared to T3. It has got a much larger half-life. The half-life of T4 is 5 to 7 days, whereas the half-life of T3 is less than 24 hours. And as I just said, it is secreted in much greater quantity by the thyroid gland in compared to T3. So in a normal euthyroid patient, the thyroid gland secretes about 100 microgram of T4 in a day, whereas only 6 microgram of T3 is secreted in a day. So coming to the actions of thyroid hormones, the thyroid hormones virtually affect most of the other organ systems. They help in regulation of carbohydrate, lipid and protein metabolism. They regulate the CNS activity and brain development. They are responsible for cardiovascular stimulation. They help in bone and tissue growth and development. They even help in GI regulation. And last but not the least, they have some role in sexual maturation as well. Hence, even ladies of infertility and PCOD sometimes are having accompanying hypothyroid along with them. So this is the biological reference interval of the 3 thyroid function tests, FT3, FT4 and TSH. These values I have taken from Teets Clinical Chemistry 7th edition. And if you look at other textbooks, these values might vary slightly, but broadly they are in the same range. FT3 normal range is 2.1 to 4.4 picogram per ml. FT4 is 0.8 to 2 nanogram per deciliter. and TSH normal range is 0.5 to 5 mu per liter, although there is now some impetus for reducing the TSH values from 5 to 2.5. But then the other side of the algorithm is that would lead to too many patients having subclinical hypothyroidism. So they do not want to put too many people in subclinical hypothyroid belt. So TSH testing should be commonly carried out in the following settings. A, in patients presenting with suspected goiters, when we screen for congenital hypothyroidism in newborn children, and in patients with atrial fibrillation, dyslipidemia, osteoporosis and infertility. Apart from that, TSH testing is now a regular part of preventive health screening as well. And because of the widespread prevalence of hypothyroidism, it's sometimes being done in a lot of preventive health packages as well. So coming to TSH versus free T4. When you are suggesting, when cases are suggestive of possible hypothalamic pituitary disease, a FT4 level should be done along with TSH in the first instance. In such patient, TSH may not be reliable indicator of regulation of T4 replacement and could be normal with just the elevation or reduction of FT4 level, suggesting secondary hypo or hyperthyroidism. When do we do FT3 and FT4? When you find TSH levels are abnormal, we usually do FT3 and FT4 determination, although FT4 alone can suffice. FT3 and FT4 levels are preferred over total T3 and T4 because, just as I said earlier, these hormones are more than 99% bound to plasma proteins, and the active forms are only the free T3 and T4, and they are going to give us a better indicator of actual physiological hypo or hyperthyroidism. Sometimes in conditions where the binding proteins would increase, like thyroid binding globulin increase in pregnancy, you can have a falsely elevated total T3 and T4, but a totally functioning normal FT3 and FT4. So what test should I order? This is something that the general physician very commonly asks me. So as per the guidelines of both American Association of Clinical Endocrinologists as well as American Thyroid Association, we do TSH alone if hypothyroidism is suspected. We do FT4 and TSH if hyperthyroidism is suspected or for routine evaluation. We do FT3 only if T3 toxicosis is suspected. This I will discuss a little later. And for follow-up of treatment of patient on L-Troxin or Thyronorm, we only do TSH. And we usually don't order for total T4 or T3. So ideally what we should do is TSH or FT4 with TSH and only FT3 when we are suspecting FT3 or T3 toxicosis. So values. Since TSH level change dynamically in response to alteration of T3 and T4, the initial approach is to test the TSH level. Currently, we have both 4th and 5th generation TSH assays available, which can detect TSH as low as 0.0025 mu per liter. But for most clinical purposes, a TSH value of less than 0.1 are considered sufficient. Coming to the classification of hypothyroidism, basically there are two main categories: primary hypothyroidism and secondary or central hypothyroidism. Amongst the primary hypothyroidism, you could have a hypothyroidism with enlarged thyroid like Hashimoto, iodine deficiency, drug-induced like lithium amiodarone or dysharmogenesis, and hypothyroid with normal thyroid. We could have a post-ablative hypothyroidism, or we could have a congenital hypothyroidism in newborn children. Secondary hypothyroidism is when there is problem in the pituitary hypothalamic axis. So the classical pattern in primary hypothyroidism, which is the most common form of hypothyroidism, is that the TSH levels are classically elevated, the FT4 or T4 levels are reduced, and plasma T3 measurement is usually of no value here because in most cases the FT3 or the total T3 levels are normal. Coming to subclinical hypothyroidism, this is very common in our country, and a lot of patients of subclinical hypothyroidism are often overtreated by the general practitioners who are very eager to give patients L-Troxin. What happens there is classically that the TSH levels are increased, but the FT4 levels are normal. And usually the TSH levels are very mildly increased between 5 to 10. They are very seldom more than 10 in value. Most of these patients are asymptomatic and they don't need any treatment. You just need to do an annual follow-up for TSH. However, there are certain cases of subclinical hypothyroidism where treatment is indicated, and usually they are the risk when the indication is when the TSH level is more than 10 or when the female is more than 50 years of age. You should always do a anti-thyroid antibody titer when you see patient of subclinical hypothyroidism. And if the TPO titer is more than 1:1 lakh or 1,000 international units, this is a clear-cut case of Hashimoto. The treatment has to be given. When a definite goiter is present, when the patient is showing laboratory values of dyslipidemia, when there is either hypercholesterolemia or hypertriglyceridemia, you need to treat subclinical hypothyroidism, because by treating subclinical hypothyroidism, there is a 6 to 8% reduction in the total cholesterol values as well. When the patient shows symptoms even at values of TSH which are between 5 and 10, you need to treat the patients. And then there is special category when the patient is a pregnant woman, when the woman is suffering from infertility or PCOD, you need to treat subclinical hypothyroidism. So barring these few conditions, for most cases of subclinical hypothyroidism, you don't need to treat the patient and just need to do a follow-up. So 5% of the general population have got subclinical hypothyroidism. So if you start treating 5% of the population, you will start over treating a lot of patients and might lead to rather, factitious hyperthyroidism. 15% of all women more than 65 years of age are hypothyroid. Hence, in elderly female, there is, even subclinical hypothyroid should be treated. Detecting subclinical hypothyroidism in pregnancy is highly essential. We should order for TSH and FT4 routinely in all pregnant women at the beginning of each trimester. I will discuss thyroid and pregnancy a little later because this is a special issue. Next, coming to hyperthyroidism and hypercholesterolemia. 14% of patients with elevated cholesterol have hypothyroidism, and approximately 90% of patients with overt hypothyroidism have increased cholesterol and or triglyceride. So when the patient is having hyperlipidemia or hypercholesterolemia, you need to treat hypothyroidism because it can also take care of some amount of hypercholesterolemia. And this is primarily one of the reasons why some of the people advise doing thyroid testing on a fasting patient. Actually, you don't need a fasting patient to do thyroid testing, but very often hypothyroidism is also associated with hypercholesterolemia and hypertriglyceridemia. Hence, when you do a lipid profile along with hypothyroidism, of course, a fasting sample is needed. Now coming to the treatment of thyroidism, briefly I will discuss T4. This is available from many brands. This is the most commonly prescribed treatment for hypothyroidism, and all patients are made euthyroid biochemically, and most but not all patients feel normal or become asymptomatic after giving them T4 replacement. The average dose is about 1.6 microgram per kg. But if you see patients who are more than 50 to 60 years old or have a pre-existing cardiac illness, you must always start with a low dose because T4 can also lead to atrial fibrillation and certain other cardiac disorders. And we need to recheck thyroid hormone levels every 4 to 6 weeks after a dose change. So whenever a dose of L-Troxin or Thyronorm has been changed, you need to do a recheck every 4 to 6 weeks. And the aim is to have a normal TSH level. Now, some people say that this normal level should ideally be below 2.5 and not be between 2.5 and 5. Next is the liothyronine or T3. This, as I discussed earlier, has a much shorter half-life than T4. Hence, we need a slow release pill and twice daily dosing is often needed. It is 10 times more potent, hence palpitation and other cardiac side effects are more common. And also high T3 levels with low T4 level is not physiological either. Hence, T3 is not the preferred substitute treatment for patients of hypothyroidism because of more frequent dosing, more side effects, and it is not physiological either. So coming to the algorithm of hypothyroidism, we first measure TSH in a patient, as I just said, according to the AS guidelines. And if we have an elevated TSH, we go for a FT4 measurement. Now, if this FT4 measurement is low, this confirms our diagnosis of primary hypothyroidism. However, we still need to do testing for anti-thyroid antibodies. And if the TPO is positive, the diagnosis of Hashimoto is confirmed and we go for T4 repletion. Even when the TPO is negative, we still go for T4 repletion. But the advantage of doing T4 is then in Hashimoto, the thyroidism could fluctuate anywhere from hypothyroid to euthyroid to hyperthyroidism. and more frequent fluctuations are more common. Hence, we need to understand whether Hashimoto is there or not. And also, Hashimoto has some risk of progression to both thyroid lymphoma as well as thyroid malignancy. So we need to know from a prognostic point of view whether Hashimoto is there or not. However, if the FT4 is normal, this is what I just told earlier, is subclinical hypothyroidism. And if we rule out certain other conditions and thyroiditis, if T4 is negative, TPO is negative, we just need to put the patient on an annual follow-up. However, if the thyroid antibodies, especially T4, is positive, the diagnosis of Hashi is still entertained and we still need to give T4 repletion. On the contrary, if the TSH is normal and we are not suspecting pituitary, we don't need to do any further testing. However, if we are considering pituitary, we measure the FT4 values, and if FT4 values are normal, we again stop testing. However, if the FT4 values are low, we evaluate the pituitary for either sick euthyroid or drug-induced, secondary hypothyroidism, etc. But for most cases, if the FT4 is normal, or if we do not consider pituitary, we stop testing there and then itself. So now, next, coming to causes of hyperthyroidism, there is Graves' disease or diffuse thyroid enhancement, or there could be Plummer's disease or functioning solitary thyroid nodule. We could have toxic multinodular goiter. We could see hyperthyroidism in cases of thyroiditis. There could be factitious hyperthyroidism, especially in overtreated patients with subclinical hypothyroidism. Also, hyperthyroidism could be drug-induced either through iodine, amiodarone, or lithium, or we could have secondary hyperthyroidism of the pituitary hypothalamic origin. So first, coming to primary hyperthyroidism, which is the most common form of hyperthyroidism, the TSH values are low and the FT3 and the FT4 values are increased. In a very small percentage of these hyperthyroid patients, the total T4 and FT4 values are both normal, but instead we see an elevation of the FT3 or the total T3 values. This condition is known as T3 hyperthyroidism or T3 thyrotoxicosis. So when you do an FT4 and TSH and the TSH value is low and the FT4 value is normal, but you are still seeing symptoms of hyperthyroidism, you should proceed to doing an FT3 values. And if FT3 is elevated, you should consider a diagnosis of T3 thyrotoxicosis. Coming to toxic multinodal goiter, this could present just as a goiter or as subclinical hyperthyroidism or with mild thyrotoxicosis. Patients can exhibit certain cardiac symptoms, could be coming to you in atrial fibrillation or palpitation or tachycardia. The patient could have tremor, nervousness, and even weight loss. Usually, antithyroid drugs along with beta blockers are given to control clinical features of thyrotoxicosis. However, in certain cases, radioiodine may need to be given, or when the size of the multinodule is too big, we might need to do a surgery also. Now, coming to subclinical hyperthyroidism, in this, the TSH levels are low, but the FT3 and FT4 levels are normal. This very rarely progresses to hyperthyroidism. In men, the progression is 0% per year. In women, it is 1.5% per year. But if the patient, along with subclinical hyperthyroidism, has a toxic multinodular goiter or a toxic adenoma, the progression can be 5% per year, and hence these cases need to be treated even for subclinical hyperthyroidism. So broadly, most cases of subclinical hyperthyroidism do not need any treatment. The indications for treatment are any pre-existing cardiac illness, when the age is more than 60 years, when the patient has either toxic multinodular goiter or toxic adenoma, and when the patient has moderate to severe osteoporosis. So coming to the algorithm for diagnosing hyperthyroidism, again, you begin with measuring TSH levels. If the TSH levels are low, the next thing you do is you measure the FT4 levels. If the FT4 levels are normal, you measure the FT3 levels. Again, if these levels are normal, then this is a case of subclinical hyperthyroidism and you don't treat it. However, if the FT3 levels are elevated, now this is a case of T3 thyrotoxicosis and you need to treat these patients. In contrast, if the FT4 levels are high, this is now a case of primary hyperthyroidism and you check for the thyroid uptake. If the thyroid uptake is low, you again measure thyroglobulin, and if it is decreased, this is a case of exogenous thyroid production. However, if the Thyroglobulin levels are increased. This could be a case of either thyroiditis or iodine exposure or rarely extraglandular production. However, if the thyroid uptake is high, as is more often the case, you need to check whether the uptake is diffuse or nodular. If it is diffuse, it is Graves' disease. If it is nodular, you need to check whether it is multinodular or it is single nodular. If it is multinodular, it is toxic multinodular goiter. If you see a single nodular, it's toxic adenoma or Plummer's disease. And if you have elevated TSH levels, you need to look at the pituitary thing. If the FT4 levels are high, this is secondary hyperthyroidism, and you do need to do the workup for the pituitary. So this is basically the algorithm where you differentiate different kind of hyperthyroidism, primary from secondary, exogenous from endogenous, Graves from toxic multinodular goiter, toxic adenoma, and secondary hyperthyroidism. Next, coming to the thyroid antibodies. These are very important to confirm diagnosis, especially for thyroiditis as well as Graves' disease. TPO and TG are classically elevated in thyroiditis, and TSH receptor antibodies are helpful in diagnosis and management of Graves' disease. They can also be used in help in prediction of postpartum Graves' disease, and they can be useful in identification of orbitopathy in the absence of features of thyrotoxicosis. Now coming to thyroid and pregnancy. Now this is very important. First, you need to understand the normal physiology here. In pregnancy, there is increased estrogen secretion, which in turn leads to increased thyroid binding globulin. Hence, the total T4 and T3 levels are increased in pregnancy, but the FT3, FT4 levels are normal because of the increase in the thyroid binding globulin. Also, HCG values peak at the end of first trimester and then begin to decrease. The HCG being weak TSH agonist, so may cause slightly more goiter. The T4 and T3 do not close placenta, or even if they do so minimally. So patients who are already hypothyroid when they become pregnant will need increase of 25% in their L-troxin dosage because of pregnancy, because of the increase in the thyroid binding globulin levels. The risk of patients with hypothyroidism in pregnancy are, there could be increased risk of spontaneous abortion, increased risk of hypertension, as well as preterm gestation. So because of these risks, you need to even treat subclinical hypothyroidism in pregnancy. Coming to another important aspect of pregnancy, about 5% of women develop postpartum thyroiditis in pregnancy. Usually this happens for up to 1 year postpartum. Very common is Hashimoto's disease here, or lymphocytic thyroiditis, where basically initially there is a lot of lymphocytic infiltrate and later there is follicular destruction of the thyroid follicles. Also, in postpartum patients, sometimes there can be exacerbation of Graves' disease as well. So coming to the limitation of the thyroid function tests. These tests are usually measured by immunoassays, either ELISA or chemiluminescence, or CLIA as we usually call it, which use specific antibodies and are subject to occasional interference. The most common here being biotin interference, and certain assays which use biotin, their biotin levels at which interference occurs are now mentioned in most kit inserts. So before you do this thyroid test, it would be prudent for you to take history of multivitamin intake and the dosage of the patient, and any interference that it might or might not have. If you think that the patient is taking very high dosage of multivitamins, it would be prudent to wean them off multivitamins for a week or so. Unexpected results should be repeated to assure that there is no impact of non-thyroid illness, diurnal variation or laboratory variation. So non-thyroid illness means there are certain illnesses, especially viral infections, where you could find normal TSH levels with low FT3 and FT4, and which are got nothing to do with hyper or hypothyroidism. They are just transient and will become okay. Now TSH is one hormone which has a significant diurnal variation. Its peak values are usually at around 2 AM in the night, and its nadir values are sometime around 3 to 4 PM in the afternoon. So, and the nadir values are about 50% of the peak values. So understanding what time of the day the thyroid hormone is done is important. Preferably the patient should be encouraged to give their repeat values on the same time as they had done on the previous day. Doing at different times of the day could sometimes confuse the clinician. And last but not the least, there is laboratory variation, which could be either due to imprecision, which is less common, but more commonly because of the systemic difference in the way the immunoassays are conducted. I will discuss this in detail a little later. If the lab results are inconsistent with clinical picture, you must communicate to this laboratory and request for 2 checks. First, confirm the specimen identity using sample audits, and then reanalyze the specimen, preferably using alternate manufacturer's assay. Because between manufacturer to manufacturer, even within CLIA, there is a 30 to 70% variation between assays. So, you know, an assay that could show subclinical hypothyroidism on X manufacturer could show a perfectly normal result on Y manufacturer even when you repeat the assay. So what do you think? Clinical laboratory tests performed by different laboratories have comparable results? True or false? Well, unfortunately, the answer is false. And actually, it is not the fault of any laboratory, more often than not. So there is something called as IFCC, or International Federation of Clinical Chemistry and Laboratory Medicine. In 2012-13, they formed a committee for standardization of thyroid function tests. And we have on panel one of our Indian friends, Barnali Das from Mumbai, who's on this committee. The primary objective of this committee is for aiming a global standardization of thyroid function testing and working toward this with various IVD manufacturers. So luckily for FT4, they have now been able to form an international reference material which is traceable across different manufacturers. And this FT4 method uses in clinical practice. Some of the assays are giving results which are less than 50% compared to the reference material. So now these manufacturers are in the process of re-standardizing their available FT4 assays and try to re-standardize as close to the reference material as possible. This is the traceability of the international reference material, 468 crystalline material. And fortunately, most of the companies are now slowly and gradually aligning their FT4 assays to this traceable standard. The bigger problem is coming with TSH, because the WHO international reference material, which is actually coming from pituitary cadaver, is actually a multimeric assay using multiple glycated forms. And this is not, you know, coming commutable to the values that are seen in serum values. So when your reference material is non-commutable, so to understand non-commutable, we need to first understand the definition of commutable. So the commutability is the ability of the reference material to have inter-assay properties which are comparable to the properties demonstrated by authenticated clinical specimens when measured by more than one measurement procedure. So this reference pituitary cadaveric material is non-commutable. Hence, we cannot standardize the TSH assay. So what we are now trying to do is we are trying to harmonize the TSH assay, which means that we are trying to use an all procedure trim means as surrogate reference material for TSH. So we are trying to take as many manufacturers as possible and bringing their means and using a mean of their means, which is an all procedure trim mean. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to pull up the TSH assays which have got mean towards the lower side towards central tendency. Likewise, we are pulling down the TSH assays which have got a mean towards the higher side, again towards central tendencies. And we have done some in-house correlation studies where, you know, the difference between manufacturers at the lower end of the spectrum and the higher end of the spectrum is as high as up to 70%. So this is still work in progress, and we are all waiting till such time that they harmonize this. We will have to continue to live with varying TSH levels across different laboratories, across different manufacturers. Having said that, let's just play a game to ease you up. This is called the 9 square game. This is a game which is used to evaluate our thyroid patient. And believe you me, after you see this game, you will think that most of my presentation earlier was redundant. This game has been developed by both American Association of Clinical Endocrinologists and the International Thyroid Society guidelines. So what we do here is, on the y-axis we have the FT4 divided into low, normal, high, and on the x-axis we have TSH again divided into low, normal, high. We have 9 squares here, and as you can see, this white square in the center is where we have normal TSH and normal FT4 values and no price for guessing. this square of plasma. Next, we have this square where the TSH levels are high and the FT4 levels are low. And again, this is very simple. This is a case of primary hypothyroidism. Next, we have this red square on the top where the FT4 levels are high and the TSH levels are low. Again, this is simple. This is a case of primary hyperthyroidism. Let's look at this green square at the bottom where both FT4 and TSH levels are low. This is a case of secondary hypothyroidism where both FT4 and TSH are low. Let's look at this red square on the extreme top. Here both FT4 and TSH are high. This is a case of secondary hyperthyroidism. Let's look at this pink square in the middle. The FT4 values are normal, but the TSH values are low. This is a case of subclinical hyperthyroidism, where you have normal FT4 but low TSH. Next we have is this blue square on the right. The FT4 levels are normal and the TSH levels are high. As I told earlier, this is a case of subclinical hyperthyroidism. This is very common in this country and very often overtreated also. Next we have FT4 levels are low, but the TSH levels are normal. This is very often seen in non-thyroid illnesses and very often in certain viral illnesses. And this is transient in nature. After some time when you repeat, the FT4 levels will become normal. Next we have here FT4 levels are high and the TSH levels are normal. This is again could be non-thyroid illness or more often factitious case when patient is on L-Troxin, slightly over-treated patients, which is very often in this country when you start either on high dose of L-Troxin or you start treating patients of subclinical hypothyroidism. Finally, this is how the 9 square would look like. You have 9 different square depicting 9 different diagnoses. If you can understand this 9 square game, you can pretty much solve the entire puzzle that is there to the basic thyroid evaluation. And with these words, I'd like to thank you all. If there are any questions, I'll be too glad to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suri. You have brought really a good topic, and there were many doubts which many of the professionals must be having, and I hope that all these doubts are clear. So there are many questions which has been put on Facebook as well as on Zoom. So I'll just try to read few of the relevant questions. And one question is put by how to manage the circadian variation in TFT.
Okay, this is a very important question. Circadian variation is very important, especially more for TSH than for other assays. And the peak values are usually seen after midnight at around 2 a.m. in the night is the peak value of TSH. And the nadir point is sometime around late afternoon, around between 2 p.m. 3 p.m. is the nadir value. So the best time to do a TSH is doing it in morning, whereas it is kind of in between the peak and the nadir value. But more important than even choosing a time is that you must instruct the clinician and the patient to do TSH from at the same time when you are doing it first time, when they are doing it on follow-up. Because if they end up coming sometimes in the morning, sometime in the evening, we will never be able to get any measure of hold on the circadian rhythm. So if the patient is say coming at 10 a.m. or 12 p.m. or even 4 p.m. every day, then every time they should come at the same time. But ideal time would be sometime early morning, where it would be ideally somewhere between the peak and the nadir value. It will be around its mean point.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Dr. Suri. There is one more question. What could be concluded if FT3 and FT4 are normal, but TSH is below 0.4?
So a normal FT3 and FT4 and a low TSH is basically suggesting secondary hyperthyroidism.
Okay, so there are 2-3 questions from Facebook which I could note down. One is due to lack of assay harmonization, the values varies. Does it lead to further complication of the thyroid management?
Yes, it does.
Thank you, sir. Sir, there is one more question from Facebook. Does the medication of carrying mother affect the developing fetus in later stages?
No, it doesn't. T3 and T4 very seldom cross the placenta.
Okay. Sir, there is one more question. Does diet at the time of sampling affect TFT values?
So there are two components to it. If by diet you are meaning, post-prandial state, then it doesn't affect much because the interference of triglyceride is at 1500 and above in most of the assays. So a normal patient, even if he's post-prandial, would not have a triglyceride, would be in excess of 450, 500. You need to have a, type 4 hyperlipidemia patient. But even in that case, even the fasting values would be in excess of 450, 500. So if you see a grossly lipemic serum, there could be some prudence in asking for a fasting sample. Otherwise, it is not. However, if you are asking diet from a point of view of taking multivitamins and especially biotin, then yes, as I told in my presentation, biotin does have interference, especially when taken at high doses. So a history of intake of multivitamin at high doses is important. And if you feel that the doses are too high, it would be prudent to ask the patient to, remove vitamin B complex from their diet for about a week and then come.
Thank you, sir. Sir, there is one more question. What is the role of ultra-sensitive or fourth generation assay in management of subclinical hypothyroidism?
Actually, it doesn't matter much because frankly, whether the level is 0.05 or it is 0.0025 is just an indicator of the level of hyperthyroidism. But this is a good marketing ploy. But most of the assays that we are currently using on CLIA from any manufacturer is by and large fourth and fifth generation only. So third generation TSH, I have not seen any good manufacturer sell at this point in time.
Sir, there is one more question from Facebook. Is there any significance of total T3?
So total T3 and total T4 do not have much significance. FT3 and FT4 are more useful, and FT3 is useful primarily in cases of T3 thyrotoxicosis. Otherwise, even FT3 is not needed for routine thyroid testing. FT4 and TSH would suffice.
Okay, thank you, sir. These were the questions. There are many more questions. What we will do, we'll just note down the questions, and if anybody they do have some further questions, they can write us, and we will try to clarify all your doubts.
You can share my email ID with them.
Yeah, surely, sir. I'll share. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you once again that you gave us time, to share your experience in management of thyroid illness. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gaurav. Thanks.
Thank you.
DP, you can share the screen now.
Sure. Our second speaker is Dr. V. Sunanda. Dr. V. Sunanda is professor and HOD of biochemistry. She's working with Mamta Academy of Medical Sciences, Hyderabad. Dr. Sunanda is MD in biochemistry from Osmania Medical College, Hyderabad. She has worked with the Pratima Institute of Medical Sciences as an assistant professor, and she has worked as a professor and HOD with the Kamaini Academy of Medical Sciences. The area of interest where Dr. Sunanda is working is clinical laboratory quality control and endocrinology, and her passion is teaching, and she is enable assessor also. And she has done, more than 15 publications in some reputed national and international journal. So let's begin with the topic of vitamin D, all about vitamin D. Dr. Sunanda, over to you.
DP, I think ma'am just got disconnected. So probably we can more questions from with the help of Dr. Suri, sir.
Yeah. So if anyone is having any further questions related to thyroid, then we will be more than happy to answer the query, and we will request Dr. Suri to help us in addressing the queries of our audience or participants.
DP and Priyank.
Yeah.
Dr. Suri is not available now.
Okay.
DP.
Yeah. Please.
Dr. Suri is not available. I think he got disconnected due to something.
Okay.
So let's wait for Dr. Vishwananda.
Sure. Thank you.
DB, can you add some more of your experience on thyroid testing and why it is different to different manufacturer, and what is a manufacturer's standpoint on thyroid testing?
Yeah, see, the purpose of choosing these topics, because if we see thyroid and vitamins, these are very commonly prescribed and processed tests in laboratory setups. So although these are very common tests, but there are many challenges what we face generally with the interpretation. And that's why we thought to go to the basics, and as Dr. Suri has clarified most of the points in managing the thyroid subclinical cases in hyper as well as hypothyroidism. So the second topic what we have chosen is vitamin D. So in vitamin D also, because there are a lot of variations from manufacturer to manufacturer, we see actually, being a technical person, when we see in the field, we are facing so many queries of result variations. So we will try to see the complete picture of this vitamin D analysis, and what are the challenges in interpretation of vitamin D. So let's hear it from Dr. Sunanda once she join back.
Also, DP, there's always a question of that Dr. Suri was elaborating that different thyroid reporting is different from different machines. So how do one ensure the quality or the reporting? Could you put some light on that?
See, as different manufacturers, as Dr. Suri has given, I think Dr. Sunanda has joined us. So. As Dr. Suri has highlighted, there are certain variations which he highlighted very clearly, and because we are also facing these kind of questions due to lack of assay harmonization. Many a time varying values we are receiving in different platforms, on different platforms. So he has emphasized where the values are high, what are the interferences, and where the values are low. So as this assay harmonization still has not happened, but at our local level, with our instrument, we try to do some assay harmonization, so which the results of which we are sharing with our customers.
DP is ma'am, I think is on, and I've made her. So ma'am, you can start sharing the screen now. You can stop sharing, DP.
Sure.
Ma'am, you can share the screen, ma'am. Please unmute you. There is a unmute button.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes.
Yes, yeah. You want me to share my screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Just a minute. Yeah, is that fine?
Yes.
Yes. Presentation.
Ma'am, presentation mode.
Okay.
Yeah. It's audible. It's visible.
Okay. Yes. You want me to start?
Yes, please.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So, very good afternoon to all colleagues who are watching this particular session today. At the outset, I would like to thank Team Mindray for giving me this opportunity. And the topic given to me by Mr. Ravi Ranjan is that something in relation to vitamin D on a KI panel. So, whatever the little bit knowledge I have, I just want to share with you today. Now, let me start with the session. As we all know, vitamin D is a sunshine vitamin because whenever we get exposed to sun rays, it is very much important for us to synthesize the vitamin D. So, my objectives for today's session is something in relation to history, introduction, chemistry, its synthesis, biochemical functions, a little bit about the deficiency manifestations, and a little bit about assay methods and its interpretation. Whatever the knowledge I have, I'll try to share with you. So this is something in relation to the history. In 1600s, the first description of rickets is being given by Bristler and Glisson. Later in 1918, Sir Edward Millen found that there is a fat-soluble vitamin which can be called as vitamin D. In 1923, Goldblatt and Soames demonstrated exposure to sunlight or UV-light produced a substance with similar property. Similar properties what earlier people have said. And in 1936, identification of vitamin D was done by Meadows. Then, you may be confused what kind of foods or the supplements we need to get vitamin D. Okay, so they can be available in the form of supplements, synthetic supplements, or in foodstuffs. Could it be vegetarian and non-vegetarian? Many at times, much is available through non-vegetarian diet and even through sunlight. When the body or the skin get exposed to sun rays, UV rays which are present in the sun is going to help us in synthesizing the vitamin D. So these are the few food sources which are in relation to vitamin D. Much of the vitamin D is going to get available to us in animal food sources, fatty fish especially, and even the milk, fortified milk. Twice. Fortified milk is the best source for us, and butter and cheese are the next rich food sources for vitamin D. Coming to the little bit of the chemistry, it is a fat-soluble vitamin, and it is a sterol-containing steroid nucleus, which contains cyclopentanoparhydrophenanthine ring structure. In chemistry, from biochemistry side, we call it as CPPP nucleus. It functions like hormone. Let us come to that in later slides. And it is going to be existed in two forms: vitamin D2, which is the ergosterol coming from plant kingdom, and vitamin D3, that is the cholecalciferol, which is going to be synthesized in us when skin is get exposed to sunlight. So vitamin D3, 90 to 95% of the vitamin D existing is cholecalciferol. It is produced from the conversion of 7-dehydrocholesterol in the skin upon exposure to sunlight. Vitamin D2 is ergosterol, which is acquired in the diet, especially from plant kingdom. Few differences between D3 and D2. D3 is cholecalciferol, D2 is ergocalciferol. D3 is synthesized within the body, D2 is obtained from the plant life, and this is a naturally derived supplement. D2 is synthetically derived supplement. D3 level significantly increases vitamin D levels in the body. Moderate increases in vitamin levels correspond to D2. And this is recommended by the experts for the optimal function and even to support the immune support from vitamin D3. Vitamin D2 is an alternative form for which is appropriate for vegetarians. Coming to the synthesis part, whether we take through the diet or whether it is the skin exposing to the sunlight, the 7-dehydrocholesterol, which is present in the skin, initially get converted to vitamin D3. This combines with vitamin D binding protein In the circulation, it circulates in combination with vitamin D binding protein. That particular complex enters into the liver first. In the liver's first hydroxylation reaction taking place by 25 hydroxylase enzyme, converting that vitamin D3 to 25 hydroxy vitamin D. Then it is being transferred to kidneys. In the kidneys, it is acted upon by 1 alpha hydroxylase enzyme, converting 25 hydroxy D3 into 125 dihydroxy D3, which is the active form of the enzyme. Vitamin. This particular vitamin now 125 dihydroxy vitamin D3, otherwise known as calcitriol, which is the active form of the vitamin. Principally, it mediates three functions: acting through the intestine, acting through the brain, and acting through the kidney. So we'll come to see that particular function in my coming slides. Then 25 hydroxy vitamin D is present in blood at up to 1000-fold higher concentration compared to active 125 dihydroxy vitamin D. 25 hydroxy vitamin D has a longer half-life, which is about 2 to 3 weeks, that is about 21 days. Coming to dihydroxy vitamin D, that is 125 dihydroxy vitamin D, which is a very short half-life containing vitamin, that is about only 4 hours. Therefore, 25 hydroxy vitamin D is the best analyte to assess vitamin D status, as it has longer half-life compared to dihydroxy vitamin D. Coming to the mechanism of action, I said it functions like a hormone. So when we classify the hormones which are existing in the human body in biochemistry, we classify based on the mechanism of action as group 1 hormones and group 2 hormones. Group 1 hormones are the hormones which contain that sterol nucleus. Being this vitamin D which is containing sterol nucleus in this particular vitamin structure, it functions similar to steroid hormones. That is, this particular vitamin combines with vitamin receptors, vitamin D receptors, which can directly act on the DNA. From there, it forms through transcription its respective mRNA. That particular mRNA later enters into the process of translation to produce its respective protein, that particular protein being carbindin. Okay, we'll come to that in a later slide. Now, coming to the biological functions of vitamin D, broadly, they are classified as calcemic functions or effects and extracalcemic effects. So let us see the calcemic effects first. Calcemic effects are exerted at intestine level, at the level of bone, and even at the level of kidney. Coming to its action at the level of intestine, acting through DNA, it is going to synthesize its mRNA. That mRNA enters into the process called translation to produce its respective protein called carbindin. This particular carbindin is a calcium binding protein. This transports or absorbs the calcium from the lumen into the intestinal cell, from there into the circulation. So acting through the intestine, it helps in the increased absorption of calcium, acting through calcium binding protein carbindin. Then acting on the bone, we all know it is a bone mineralization which is going to happen by the presence of this particular vitamin D. If we have sufficient levels of vitamin D, mineralization of the bone is going to happen in a sufficient manner, or else it may it goes in a revert process. Acting on the kidney, calcitriol increases the reabsorption of calcium and phosphorus by renal tubules. That is the important function, what it is going to exert at the level of the kidney. Coming to the extracalcemic effects, it affects almost all the organ systems in the body, especially on the heart and even on the reproductive system. It is even affecting the immune system of the body. So let us see how it is going to affect the extracalcemic function. So coming to effect of vitamin D on immune system, it will enhance chemotaxis, and phagocytosis. By doing so, it enhances the antimicrobial response. At the same time, it even activates the macrophage differentiation. In other way, the presence of vitamin D inhibits the dendritic cells. The dendritic cells are the cells which will regulate the immune function, which is leading to autoimmunity or autoimmune damage. So by inhibiting the maturation of dendritic cells, vitamin D has its role on immune system. Coming to its effect on reproductive system, some studies showed that low vitamin D status during pregnancy interferes in the development of the placenta. Later on, that leads to some deformities in fetal programming, which is going to affect the development of the baby and even preeclampsia. And this may lead to preeclampsia in pregnancy, later on maternal hypertension. It's little bit of its effect is seen even on the heart disease. Vitamin D deficiency is an unrecognized emerging cardiovascular risk factor. Low vitamin D activates renin-angiotensin aldosterone system, and in doing so, it predisposes the patients to hypertension and a stiffening and thickening of the heart and blood vessels. Thus, vitamin D deficiency alters the hormone levels and immune function, which can increase the risk of diabetes, which is a major contribution to cardiovascular disease. What are the causes for this vitamin D deficiency? Okay, so reduced synthesis of cholecalciferol in the skin, reduced sun exposure, which can result from aging, veiling, illness, or immobility. Staying indoors, much of the time if you stay indoors, it leads to vitamin deficiency. Nowadays, what vitamin D deficiency is very much common in software employees, where they are going to sit in AC rooms, not much getting exposed themselves to sunlight, and veiling due to some religious issues. Some of the vitamin D deficiency is also going to be seen. The other important cause for this particular vitamin D deficiency is malabsorption. Small bowel disorders like celiac disease, inflammatory bowel disease, infiltrative disorders, or if there is small bowel resection, can cause the malabsorption. Some of the pancreatic disorders like chronic pancreatitis, cystic fibrosis, biliary obstruction. These are all some of the causes for vitamin D deficiency. And even enhanced degradation of vitamin D, which is due to some of the drugs, antitubercular drugs like rifampicin or anticonvulsants. These things will enhance the degradation of vitamin D, which may contribute to or exacerbate vitamin D deficiency. Then what are the risk factors for this vitamin D deficiency? Having very dark skin, being elderly, being overweight and obese, not eating non-vegetarian diet, people who are non-vegetarians, living far from equator where there is little sun throughout the year, and many of the people are using nowadays sunscreens, using sunscreen lotion continuously, whether they stay indoor or when they go outdoors. At the same time, staying much of the time indoors, that is within the room, maybe within the working area or within our own homes, not going outside. Nowadays, because of maybe this COVID, we are not moving much on outside not exposed to outside atmosphere, which may lead to one of the contributing risk factor to vitamin D deficiency. Coming to the signs and the symptoms, there is loss of appetite, back pain, low mood, there is disturbances in mood, sleep changes, it even leads to fatigue, pale skin, infection, frequent cough and cold, decreased muscle strength, weakness, and bone aches. These are the few important serious symptoms regarding vitamin D deficiency. The important deficiency manifestations we already know, we are being studying since ages. These are osteomalacia in elderly people or adults, and rickets in young people, that is the children. So rickets, we all know, there is delayed closure of the fontanelle, frontal gaussing, dental hypoplasias, pectus carinatum, swelling in the wrist and ankle joints, bowing of the legs, horizontal sulcus, rickety rosary, craniotabes, and white sutures. These are the few important clinical features which we are going to see in rickets. Okay. Then, what are the indications for this vitamin D measurement? When there are clear-cut signs and symptoms in relation to rickets, osteomalacia, definitely we go for vitamin D estimation. Apart from these two, even the people who are having chronic kidney disorders, hepatic failures, malabsorption syndromes, hyperparathyroidisms, pregnancy and lactation, and some chronic disorders, and some of the cancers like lymphomas. Whenever we find such kind of the signs and symptoms in relation to these particular problems in a patient, it is generally needed for screening for vitamin D estimation. So what exactly we are doing? As we all know, half-life of 25-hydroxy vitamin D is 21 days and 125-dihydroxy vitamin D is only 4 hours. Now, vitamin D, as such, that is 25-hydroxy vitamin D, has a long half-life, which is stable in nature and higher in concentration compared to active vitamin D, that is 125-dihydroxy vitamin D, which is 1,000 times more than this active form. This can reflect the total amount of vitamin D synthesized by food intake or exposure to sunlight. So, 25-hydroxy vitamin D is the best indicator of the nutritional status of the vitamin D. Okay, so which can contribute to both the areas. Then, which form should be measured? Circulating serum 25-hydroxy vitamin D, best available indicator of cutaneous synthesis, either through sunlight from the skin or total intake either through food or from vitamin supplementation. And it is the major circulating form having long half-life, and it can measure the storage form also. Because of the widespread use of both vitamin D2 and D3 supplements, assay should measure both the forms 25-hydroxy vitamin and 125-hydroxy vitamin D2 and D3. Only few techniques are there which can identify both the measurements of D2 and D3. We'll come to that in later slides. And what should not be measured? It is the parent vitamin D which is not going to be measured, that is the precursor forms. Many a times the very active short half-life vitamin, that is 125 vitamin D. Better is 25-hydroxy vitamin D because its concentrations are more stable and for a longer time they are present in the circulation. And this can best correlate with the clinical signs of vitamin D deficiency. That's what the previous studies have proved. Then what would be the reference ranges? Different studies have shown different reference ranges. National Institute of Health and National Osteoporosis Society, they have given the ranges as less than 12.5 nanograms per ml definitely indicate there is a deficiency of vitamin D. In between the levels of 12.5 to 20 nanograms per ml, it gives the representation as inadequacy of vitamin D. More than 20 nanograms per ml shows sufficient levels. But there is a slight difference from that particular level to the levels given by Endocrine Society or International Osteoporosis Foundation. Those people have given that whenever the vitamin D goes less than 20 nanograms per ml, it shows the deficiency of vitamin D. In between 20 to 30 nanograms per ml, it shows the inadequacy of the vitamin D. More than 30 nanograms per ml shows the sufficient amounts of vitamin D which is there in the body of that particular person. So Mindray has given the same values as the Endocrine Society and International Osteoporosis Foundation. In our lab, as we are using the CLIA method, equipment is from Mindray that is CL1000I we are using. So we are using these kind of interpretation levels. Deficiency, we can say below 20 nanograms per ml. Insufficiency, that is in between 20 to 30 nanograms per ml. Sufficiency between 30 to 100. Anyway, it is going above 100 nanograms per ml. It can represent as toxicity of the vitamin. The vitamin D levels are mainly affected by the factors such as race, gender, age, season. Okay, winter to summer, there is some variation. Lifestyle, based on the lifestyle, indoor, outdoor games, or the sports people, eating habits, clothing habits, exposure to sunlight, latitude, altitude of the residence. These are all the few factors which can affect the ranges of this particular vitamin. So it has larger differences in vitamin D levels among people in all the regions of the world. So there is currently no single evaluation standard available for the level of vitamin D to be taken as a benchmark. Then we can get a doubt that just we can measure some 100 to 150 healthy individuals. You can create a histogram. From there, you can derive a mean and plus or minus 2 standard deviation to take the reference range. Can it be feasible? I think it is not that easy, because it depends on our lifestyle, season, that whether it is summer or winter, or depending on the lifestyle, whether the subject is, within the office workers, there is a difference between lifeguards to office workers, and there is normal to optimal. So we need to use clinical decision limits rather than using a reference intervals to describe the vitamin D concentration. So whenever we are trying to interpret our vitamin D reports with the clinicians, we say we are using clinical decision limits, but not the exact textbook given reference intervals. Then, if you think that you are going to be deficient in vitamin D, so are you deficient in vitamin D? Can you pose a question for yourself? Then what we are doing? If I pose a question to myself, am I deficient in my levels of vitamin D? Then I'll think to go for testing with vitamin D. Okay. So many methods are available. Few methods I listed over here. Fluorescent immunoassay, ELISA, RAA, CLIA, HPLC, and LCMS. The method. Let us see one after the other. Fluorescent immunoassay. Nowadays we are getting so many small equipments, such as smaller one for a POCT purpose, which is the bedside. Assay time they say is just 15 minutes, but compared to, they say it is more sensitive, and sensitivity and specificity are good enough, but we never used as a POCT method, because for me, I think that vitamin D is not that emergency parameter which can be done through this POCT method. POCT is meant for the emergency parameters wherein the value, based on the value, you are going to save the patient. Fine. So it is not that emergency parameter compared to like your ABG, right? So we are not using, especially in our lab, in our hospital, we are not using this fluorescent immunoassay POCT method. Previously, we used to do through ELISA method. Many types of ELISAs are there: direct ELISA, indirect ELISA, sandwich ELISA, and competitive ELISA. Previously, we used to use the technique of sandwich ELISA, wherein it is a long incubation period times, where it was taking around 4 hours incubation, sometimes more than 4 hours incubation. Our technicians are trying to forget whenever they incubate at a particular stage and all. So now we have shifted from ELISA platform to CLIA platform. RAA was also available, but I don't have any experience of working with RAA. Presently, we are using the CLIA technique. Our equipment is from Mindray, so that is CL1000I, chemiluminescence immunoassay. It's a simple, user-friendly, technician-friendly, yet robust, very stable equipment as far as QCs and ECAS is concerned. No much of the breakdown we are finding. We are using the equipment last 1 year, and it is very robust to use. Fine. I'll share my experience little later. Next is the HPLC. Nowadays, people are telling that, coined as HPLC as the gold standard. You can see here the elution time, the peak of the elution time, right? So that is giving rise to the particular value of that particular vitamin. Next is the LCMS, liquid chromatography and mass spectrophotometry. This can detect both vitamin D2 and D3 levels. I don't think so CLIA platform has D2 and D3. Whatever we are doing is only total vitamin D. But using the technique of LCMS, it can detect vitamin D2 and vitamin D3 levels depending on the clinician request. If the clinician asks us to do vitamin D2, we are trying to outsource to the labs wherever the LCMS is available. Hyderabad, we have 2 or 3 centers where they have LCMS technique for differentiating vitamin D2 to D3, for having specific vitamin D2 assay values to vitamin D3. We are finding certain interferences whenever the hemoglobin levels goes beyond 50 milligrams per deciliter. High bilirubin samples, especially in babies, neonates sometimes. Bilirubin level goes beyond 20 milligrams per deciliter. Hypertriglyceridemia more than 1500 milligrams per deciliter. Total protein more than 10 grams per dl. Then it interferes with the study. So whenever you get high lipemic samples, better to ask the patient to give the next sample after taking a little gap, about 2 to 3 days, asking them to restrict the lipid diet, so on and so forth, or get back to the clinician. Say that the serum is very lipemic, where this lipemic serum, especially the triglyceride levels in the particular serum, is going to interfere in vitamin D levels. To our experience, we reported these 2 values recently. There was a boy aged about 5 years where we have reported very low value of 6 nanograms per ml. So when we try to get the history from the doctor, they say the baby is having classical symptoms of rickets. Fine. Then one more case we got very recently is 34-year-old female reported as 126 nanograms per ml. We were in little bit dilemma to give such a particular value, 126 nanograms, because which was too heavy, too high value. We had to recheck our system, recheck with the our MOU lab to give before issuing the report. We get back to the clinician regarding the history, and we called even back the female to us, and the female was telling last 3 years she is on vitamin D therapy continuously without any interruption, 2 tablets a day. That might be the result where we got such a high value. I think this is what our experience. These are few of my references for today's class. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to came in.
Thank you, Dr. Sunanda. Thank you very much. You have brought all the aspects very clearly, and I think all the participants are benefited with the knowledge you shared.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, and ma'am, there are few questions on Facebook and on Zoom. So I'll just go through one by one. There are few you have already addressed. Anyhow, I'll just read the questions. Somebody has asked, which one is clinically significant? Estimation of D3 alone or total vitamin D?
So for our experience, we are doing only total vitamin D. Fine. It depends on the clinician. Many attempts what I have that little experience what we have, but we are doing only vitamin D because that 125 dihydroxy polycalciferol, that vitamin D, which is the active form is very much unstable. That is the short, half-life is very short. So only 4 hours. So we don't know which 4 hours the value corresponds to. So I feel total vitamin D is much better.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, there is one more question. Why is that most of the samples we test in our lab is lab institute out to be deficient in vitamin D? Is it required for Indian population to change the reference interval?
Yeah, that because it depends on the production of the vitamin D within the particular population, because people who are living in colder countries where getting exposure to sunlight may be little less compared to the people who are living in tropical countries like India. So it would be better, depending on the population where you are working or where you are from where you are getting the samples, to have the clinical decision values.
Ma'am, there is one more question. Is there any particular time to get exposed to sunlight? Or
They
any?
say, yeah, it's early morning sunrise time and sunset time. So that is the time where the sun rays having more of UV radiation that is helping in the synthesis of vitamin D when our skin getting exposed to sunlight.
Thank you, ma'am. And there is one more question. Which is better in terms of diagnosis? 25 OH or 125 hydroxy vitamin D? This I think you have already
Yeah,
answered.
this is still, there is dilemma going on that. As I said previously, 125 dihydroxy cholecalciferol, that is calcitriol, that is the active form of the vitamin, but whose half-life is very short. So to my knowledge, there is no diurnal variation regarding the active form to inactive form. So much of the time available is total vitamin D. I think depending on that, they can estimate. But LCMS is the only technique wherein the differentiation between vitamin D2 to vitamin D3 is going to happen.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, there is one more question, which I think the first part of the question is same, which is, and the second part of the question is a relation to cholesterol and vitamin D is much evident now. Does it imply that higher cholesterol will improve vitamin D levels?
Yeah, that's what actually people were even thinking also. Yeah, because that amount of cholesterol, because that is a parent compound is the 7-dehydrocholesterol in the skin, which is getting exposed on exposure to sunlight is converting to vitamin D. So low cholesterol levels containing patients, there may be less production of vitamin D. In that case, they may need to supplement through the diet. Okay, so both goes together, supplementation through the diet and getting the skin exposed to sunlight, especially during early in the morning and early in the evening. So these are the areas or the timings where UV rays are more in the sunlight for the synthesis of vitamin D to occur.
Thank you. Ma'am, there is one more question. Vitamin D shelf life is 21 days.
Yeah, total.
Yeah. Is it means that we can expose to sunlight once in 21 days is sufficient?
May not be, because that early morning sun rays is going to be there for a little bit of the time. So once a day you get, maybe sometimes a little bit person can synthesize vitamin D, but regular exposure will give the sufficient amount of vitamin D to the body, not only getting exposed for 1 day in 21 days for getting the vitamin D in a sufficient level. Or in that case, they can supplement through the diet or taking the supplements along with, depending on their availability of getting exposed to sunlight or based on their working style and all, that can be.
Ma'am, there is one more question. Is there any pre-analytical measures that had to be taken?
Yeah, pre-analytical is there is no variation in the day to day, that is morning, afternoon and evening. Taking care in taking the sampling. Okay, so when we are doing in the plasma vitamin D, better to take in the lithium heparin or lithium heparin tubes to collect the blood sample when vitamin D is going to be estimated in plasma, or else serum we can take in plain tube or clot activator tube. These are the two important things to be taken into consideration. What kind of the sample you are taking for in your instrument when you are doing the estimation? Is it plasma vitamin D or serum vitamin D?
There is one more question. any effect of circadian rhythm over D3 estimation if a patient is on replacement of vitamin D? What should be the difference from time of drug intake?
Drug intake means, so there is a combination of the drug nowadays available, vitamin D along with the calcium supplement. It is a combi pill, calcitriol along with the calcium gluconate. So that is the commercial form available now. What exactly the question? Can you repeat the question?
Ma'am, this question is,
to my knowledge, there is no circadian rhythm for vitamin D release or synthesis.
and the exact question is any effect of circadian rhythm over D3 estimation if the patient is on replacement of vitamin D? What should be the difference from time of drug intake?
I've never had such an experience so far regarding that. But as supplementation is there, definitely depending on the type of supplementation and before starting the supplementation, the levels of the patient and duration of the supplementation, then later values. That can only, I can say that much, not more than that.
Yeah, ma'am, there are many questions. What I'll just note down the questions with name who has put this, and we'll share with you. So we will try to address all the queries or questions put by participants. And once again, thank you very much, ma'am. You really, given us a in-depth knowledge of vitamin D, because this is, although it is a very common parameter of every laboratory now, but it is most challenging parameter as well, because facing a lot of problems, a lot of issues in diagnosis and interventions.
Almost every 10th patient, we are getting the request for vitamin D.
Yes.
Thank you for Team Binray for giving me the opportunity for sharing my knowledge with you. Thank you all the participants who have attended my session. Thank you very much.